Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So last week I did a video on the trailer that came out for the new Fantastic Four movie and how the director of that movie has stated that the movie is based on Retrofuturism, since it's based in an idealized version of the 1960s. And a few things happened over the last week, which got me to thinking not just about the Fantastic Four movie as a part of retrofuturism, that is to say, an idealized version of the 60s, but indeed the entire canon of storytelling that we've been used to since the 1960s. And it was summed up in a comment I got on that Fantastic Four video where someone said that this idealized retrofuturism is just boomer fan fiction. And that's really what it is. It's baby boomer fan fiction. But again, it's not just this movie. If we take that way of looking at storytelling and apply it to everything since the 1960s, really, you could go back to 1945, something very interesting happens. You see that the development, if you want to call it that, of storytelling over those successive decades simply is a reflection of a baby boomer life cycle. And that's what I want to go over today, because if we want to understand the death of that life cycle, which is going to occur with the death of the baby boomers and what is to come next, we need to look back at the history of this and how it has developed. But before we get there, just a quick note, if you're looking for new storytelling, there is a link in the description for the sign-up page for my new books that are coming out called Fade to Blue. I think of it as almost an Indiana Jones story told in a film noir style, as it is set in 1929, 1930. So if that sounds interesting to you at all, click on the link in the description or the pinned comment, go on over, take a look at the trailer, take a look at some of the art, see if my new books are for you, and leave your email if you wish to be informed when the project goes live. Okay, so I want to get into how this boomer life cycle of storytelling began, really with the birth of the boomers, and really took hold within the 1960s. And I want to talk about that first as mythology, a mythology they told themselves. Then it morphed into storytelling, and it is now once again going back into mythology, especially with this Fantastic Four movie where the director, again, literally says it is an idealized version, a utopian version of the 1960s, which the entire movie is set in. But before we get there, just a couple of notes. Number one, I am presenting this as basically a hypothesis, but I've been thinking about this for a long time. I can remember, it was probably back in the late 90s when I was doing my master's program for political theory. I had to take a minor, so I took a minor, I don't know why, in public administration. I think just because it fit into my schedule. And the main professor for public admin was trying to explain using psychological means why the public administration and the mindset never changes. And he asked if anybody had any other ideas. And he's literally a guy who wrote the textbook on public administration. And I just raised my hand and said, yeah, I know exactly why it doesn't change. It doesn't change because the boomers hold on to those jobs with a death grip. And he challenged me a little on that. And I said, look, I know all these people. And yes, it's anecdotal, but I know these people. They work for government, and government is trying to reform itself right now, trying to become more efficient. So they're offering these people golden parachutes so that they'll go away. And what they do is they take these golden parachutes and then they apply for another government job, which since they're overqualified, they will get. And then they continually control the public administration and usually stack up like 3 or 4 of these golden parachutes. But anyways, the point being, this is not a new thing. All of us, every generation that has been born since the baby boomers, just simply live in a baby boomer world. Now, what does that mean? Well, that gets into a little bit of the mythologizing. And I'll try to begin to describe that by describing something else I ran into over the last week. It was a video wherein some guy was saying, this young man destroys an entire room full of boomers. It was a YouTube video, a bit hyperbolic for the title. But when I clicked on it, it was about an acquaintance of mine who is Connor Tomlinson, who works over at the Lotus Eaters, and he was part of a panel. Not a panel of people who all agreed with him, to be sure. And he was talking to this room full of people about his ideas, especially about England, about the UK, and how this entire room full of boomers simply could not understand where he was coming from. Connor, by the way, I think is simply closing in on his 30s. Anyway, I think the presenter of the video kind of missed the point. The point is, there was a fundamental disconnect between Connor and his point of view and the point of view of the audience who were made up of baby boomers. And what was that fundamental disconnect? Well, the disconnect was, as far as I can analyze the entire thing, Connor was arguing from a multipolar worldview, wherein the baby boomers were arguing from a single polar worldview. And so there was a disconnect so that, to be fair, I don't think either side understood what the other one was trying to argue. So to give you one example of the arguments that happened, Connor was talking about the lack of freedom of speech in the United Kingdom, and he kept on getting pushback from these baby boomers saying, look, if we look at Russia right now, they actually put people in prison for political dissent, for saying things against the government. Stop criticizing the United Kingdom. You're being a hypocrite in trying to say or claim that this is a worse idea, or you're a supporter of Russia, which makes you even worse. And Connor rebutted that argument, and honestly, some of the left-wing people that were sitting next to Connor also rebutted it in the same way, saying, no, I can be against what they're doing in Russia and against what they're doing here in Great Britain at the same time. The two don't have to be mutually exclusive. And again, the baby boomers simply could not understand that answer. Why? Because their mindset is unipolar. They're thinking to themselves in global terms. They cannot think in any other way besides global terms. Connor is thinking from multiple poles, saying, the Russians do this, it's bad. We in the UK do this, it's bad. But the boomers are thinking, no, we're all part of this one global system, and if you're attacking something that is not the worst example of this entire thing, you're being hypocritical. Why? Well, basically you're wasting your time trying to fix something small, in their opinion, when there are much greater examples of what we need to fix for this one system that actually controls the entire world. Now, this kind of mindset comes from the mythologizing of the 1960s. And really, the entire baby boomer generation. Now let's get more heavily into that, and then bring the entire thing to bear on storytelling. Now, I've referenced this a number of times in my videos, so I'm just going to go over it briefly. But there was a movement specifically in the 1960s, but really it started in the 1930s and just crept up and culminated in the 1960s. It's called critical theory. It came from the Frankfurt School. The men who came up with this were neo-Marxists. They are avowed neo-Marxists. And they said they're trying to reignite the grand communist global revolution because the worker revolution has stalled, and so they tried to figure out a way in order to reignite it all over the world, and they came up with critical theory. And one of the ideas of critical theory is basically a Hegelian dialectic, wherein you apply a dialectic to the Marxist idea of history and the end of history. And so you go through successive ages of history, and once you go through an age of history and it is completed, you can never go back. It is put behind a barrier of the unrepeatable. And this kind of idea was sold to the boomer generation through a very subtle and distinct mechanism. And that mechanism is flattery. So with the end of World War II, everyone in the world was looking at World War II and how devastating it was for everyone. And they were using the phrase never again, or at the very least developing the idea behind never again, which is to say, this is a prescription. We should look at it as we will never allow such a thing to happen again. But the baby boomers, who were born right after the end of the Second World War, began to morph that idea into an ideological statement rather than a prescription. An ideological statement that comes from critical theory. The idea that we have passed through this meat grinder of the Second World War. It is a bookend to history. We have passed through that, and it has gone beyond this barrier of the unrepeatable. We will never go back to that kind of thing. It will never happen again. And why? Well, why was because we, the baby boomers, were then born. This is the mythology of the baby boomers. Whether they know it or not, each one of them thinks of themselves as a miniature messiah, wherein, since they were born, part of this culmination of messiahs being born after the Second World War, and they are the ones who are bringing about an age of enlightenment, an age of Aquarius. And again, I don't pull that out of my hat. I use that term a lot because that's what they use. This age of peace and love and happiness. They are the messiahs that will bring that about. And they are the new bookend for the new age of history. And by the way, to bring it back to storytelling, let's look at that video I did last week about the director of the new Fantastic Four movie, talking about retrofuturism and the idealized version of the 1960s. It is a utopia wherein Invisible Girl, as a political actor, brings about world peace and harmony, brotherhood of all mankind through her emotional intelligence. That's literally what he says in the article. This, by the way, being the counterbalance, the outshining of Reed Richards' Mr. Fantastic and his scientific rational thinking, which allows for giant leaps forward in technology. That's outshone by her emotional intelligence and her ability to bring about world peace and brotherhood. And again, this is the mythology of the baby boomers and their birth into the world. And it's based upon the idea of the rejection of the old, Just like there is a rejection of the rationality of Mr. Fantastic, how it is a secondary thing that only helps the emotional, intelligent, invisible woman bring about the superior conditions of world peace. So it is that the baby boomers saw themselves as a rejection of the things that had come before, a rejection really of the rational in favor of the emotional, and at the same time as doing that, also a complete rejection of anything eternal, of anything transcendent, and of anything timeless. Or to put it in other terms, simply materialistic. Which again, if you look at the connection towards the ideas of critical theory, which is Marxist theory, you can see where that fits in quite nicely. But let's move out of mythology and into storytelling. If we look at the storytelling between 1945 and the 1960s, we can see an increasing development of this 60s kind of mindset, almost a teenager angst way of storytelling, which again goes with the boomer life cycle. We have to acknowledge that until the 1960s, they weren't in control of the storytelling. They were too young. It was still the major players. For myself, I look back at comic books, major players like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, all of these heavyweights who had lived through World War II. They were still in control of that storytelling. They might have had a tinge of this 1960s mindset, but they were not part of it. It wasn't default for them. But it started slowly to become the default of major storytelling companies, like, say, Marvel Comics, as you get into the 1960s, which again seems to be all over the place, haphazard, very emotionally based, very much teen angst. I want to tell a story about X, Y, and Z. Doesn't matter if it makes sense. And it wasn't until the 1970s and the progression of the boomer life cycle into one of parenthood that we get to see a significant shift in the kinds of stories that are being made. Certainly within pop culture and in what I always cover, which is science fiction and fantasy. And there is a distinct shift, a distinct event of the shift of that kind of storytelling, and it is with the release of Star Wars, A New Hope. First of all, you can see a very significant change within science fiction and fantasy with the release of that movie. Most science fiction and fantasy before that were doomsday kind of scenarios brought about by, again, people who had lived through the Second World War, looking at technology and how it will destroy them. And there is a significant change in the feel between the movies prior to Star Wars and after it. I think the last major science fiction and fantasy movie that came out before Star Wars was Logan's Run. If you want to see a tonal shift, watch Logan's Run and then Star Wars. See how drastic the storytelling changes are there. And again, I think this is expressed very neatly in the actual title for Star Wars, which is A New Hope. Prior to that, you got all this doom and gloom and things are going to go off the rails and you might as well just look into the abyss, wherein you have A New Hope, and there is a hopefulness to that storytelling. There is a hopefulness to the boomers beginning to take over that key element of culture, which is storytelling. But that hope, that brightness, which you see within the major storytelling franchises, which are still around today, which they're still milking today, franchises like Star Wars, like Indiana Jones, like E.T., that tonal shift is there because of the life cycle of the boomers. And it does have positive aspects to it, but for the wrong reasons. So I would say this new positivity in the life cycle of the boomers comes about because they began to be parents. And in being parents, they wanted to present a hopeful situation, mentality for their children. And it is expressed that way within the storytelling. But at the same time, even though they were presenting this hopeful canon of storytelling, and they were doing it in, I would say, an exceptional way, the resources that they were using in order to do so was one that was going to set the entire thing up for a downfall. Because again, as being people who are thoroughly materialistic, people who are not at all connected to the eternal, the transcendent, or even the timeless, they weren't offering timeless stories. They were simply maxing out all the old stories by using up as much as they could of the resources available to them. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, they took all of the history, all of the wealth of storytelling of Western civilization and used it without any regard to adding to it in any way. It's like a kid who takes generational wealth from his family and just starts to spend it willy-nilly on everything he wants to in order to make his life, quote-unquote, happy. He will never actually contribute anything to it, and he's simply depleting this massive store of wealth. And that's what they were doing within this kind of storytelling within the 1980s. Really, partially the 1970s and then into the 1980s. Did it produce really good stories? Did it produce something that was much more impactful than what you would normally get? Yes, indeed it did. I agree to that point. But it did it at the expense of storytelling itself. Because in using up all of their resources and in never adding to that wealth, there was a looming end to the entire thing. And as a caveat, this didn't just happen with storytelling. This is why you get in the 1980s the age of decadence. This is when you get hippies turning into yuppies. For those younger people, by the way, who don't know what a yuppie is, it is basically an old hippie who has inherited the wealth or has in somehow gotten a hold of the wealth of the generations past and is now in control of it. And this led to the age of decadence, the age of excess that we got within the 1980s. We realized it even back in the 1980s. But if we carry that forward to the end of this age of excess, what do you get? Well, again, you get into the next stage of life of the boomer, which is what? Which is basically a midlife crisis. And that's why we see the extremes starting in the late 1980s and then into the 1990s, continuing a little bit into the 2000s. The extremes of that time period wherein you have boomers who are approaching their midlife crisis thinking, how do we stay relevant? Well, they stay relevant through ensuring not only that they are in control of storytelling and other aspects of culture, but by making sure that their kind of storytelling is the one that is dominant, is the one that is still in control. And how do they do that? They take everything they did within the 1980s and they put it up to the max. They make it extreme. And this is where you get deconstruction. Because again, part of deconstruction is to say, well, you see, those old timeless stories, no, you can't go back to those. Those are no good anymore. Those have been placed behind the barrier of the unrepeatable. They're no longer relevant at all. You can't actually call them timeless. No, our kind of storytelling is the only one that's relevant. And we can show you that by simply emotionally taking logical fallacies and deconstructing those old timeless stories, old timeless heroes, and saying, you see, they don't actually work. And in a culture that is based primarily around emotion, they swallowed that line hook, line, and sinker. But then we get into basically 2008, into the 2010s, and we see a significant shift. And what is that significant shift? Well, it is a shift towards your quote-unquote progressive storytelling. Once again, I go back to Marvel Comics. 2009, they literally went out and hired someone to completely revolutionize and change the entire way that their comics were made and how their stories were told. And the basis of that entire thing was progressivism, quote-unquote progressivism. And why? Because progressivism is the child of the baby boomer. It is the child of the mentality of the baby boomer. And this is why this quote-unquote progressive storytelling, and really backing in all of culture, has been able to survive since about 2008, 2009, up to today, which is 2025. Why? Because the boomers are supporting it. That's the only reason why. And again, I went through podcast after podcast from Marvel, talking about not just Marvel Comics, but Marvel Studios, and how they kept on mentioning how the older generation had to hold the door open for these women who were coming up, these marginalized people that were coming up. Why? Because they're the successors of the boomer mentality. They're the successors of this emotional thinking to the extreme. And the reason why this came about at the time that it did, once again, has to do with the life cycle of the baby boomer. They're literally, at that time, getting to a point where they see their imminent deaths. As materialistic people who have never thought of that before, people who don't think about the eternal, the transcendent, or even the timeless, what do? Well, they try to secure their legacy. And they try to secure their legacy by ensuring that only their legacy is remembered. And how do they do that? Once again, they do that by supporting the small number of people out there who still accept their way of thinking, which is your quote-unquote progressive people. Even though those progressive people would look back at the baby boomers and say, your time is over, please shut up now. They don't care. They still support them because they are their ideological children. And so what you have seen over the last 15 plus years is, once again, this quote-unquote progressive storytelling, which only exists because of the baby boomer support of the entire thing. And again, this support of the entire thing is they're looking at themselves saying, yeah, we're about to die. We need to make our mark in history because there's no such thing as a timeless story. We're not connected to anything eternal, to anything that's really going to be remembered. So how do you do that? Well, you do that through control. And they need power in order to control. And that's why the entire quote-unquote progressive movement is centered around the idea of power. But they need to control the future. That's what they need to do. They need to control from beyond the grave. which, by the way, is something you can't do. And I mean that in so many different ways. Literally, I remember being a conveyor back in, the early 2000s, which basically goes through wills and deeds and all that kind of thing. And at one point, I went to the lawyer that I worked for and said, hey, this property, which is fairly huge and is in the middle of this city, says that no one can use any of the property to sell alcohol or distribute alcohol. I think the guy who owned it was an odd fellow, if you know what that is. Anyways, the lawyer looked at me and said, you can't do that. We all ignore that covenant. Why? Because you can't control from beyond the grave. It's a legal principle. You just can't. But again, it doesn't stop people from trying. And this is what the baby boomers are trying. They're trying to control from beyond the grave. They're saying, we're about to die. We need to exercise our control over the culture, especially storytelling, in order to once again mythologize our entire lives, our existence, our birth, our messianic life on this world that will change it forever. And of course, in political terms, that is once again going back to the idea of the unipolar world. The world that has centered itself around what? It centered itself around the birth of the boomer. This new age of Aquarius that they brought about by literally just being born. This world that will eventually morph into a global peace and harmony based upon their ideas. And that's why we get this mythologizing in movies like this new Fantastic Four movie that is coming out based upon retrofuturism. It's very much connected to a video I did a number of years ago when Black Panther came out, when it was based on Afrofuturism. But anyway, the two are strains of the same disease. It is this mythologizing, which I think you're going to see more and more, this nostalgic mythologizing of the ideas of the 1960s in order for the boomers to still feel relevant as they shuffle off this mortal coil. It is literally them having a death grip on the culture to control it in a unipolar way, which again sets themselves up as a messiah, as each a miniature messiah unto themselves. But luckily for the rest of us, all of us that have been born after the boomer generation, there will come a time in the not too distant future where there won't be enough of the boomers left to continue their death grip on our society and on our culture. And once that happens, your quote-unquote progressive movement, lacking that support, will completely crumble. They will be reduced to what they really should be, which is crackpots standing on a street corner with a sign. And then the rest of us, hopefully, can get back to building true culture and get back to things like timeless stories. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there's a link in the description for the sign-up page for my new books coming out called Fade to Blue. If you're interested at all, you can click on the link, go over, see some of the art, watch the trailer, and leave your email address if you want to be informed when the project goes live. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.